These questions are, there's less of them, but there's a lot to them. Strategy. You know, it is one of these things that a couple of times when we looked at yesterday, how do you know if you're a lead pastor or associate pastor? Yeah, I think so. How do you know if you're a lead pastor or associate pastor? I think this is more lead pastor stuff. They tend to be the things that you're like, yeah, this is going to take a lot of energy. And so as you've considered various ways new churches can be started, etc., and what would be the best strategy to get this church plant position for success? So number one, timing. Provide a timeline for planting the church that begins with approval of the church plant and ends with launch Sunday. So you think through, how long are you going to train people for? What is this timeline going to look like? Budget. Provide a basic estimate of a budget for the church plant at its first year of operation in this location, considering facility rental, size of team, necessary salary, etc. You know, the harsh and hard reality is plants cost money. You got to work out how much they're going to cost ahead of time. You don't want to get into it fingers crossed. People can even be over spiritual sometimes. Just the Lord will provide. He often provides by good pastors planning well too, and creating vision and raising funds. And so, what's the budget? How much is this thing going to cost? Number 3, mission statement. Write your proposed mission statement for this church plant. What exactly are you trying to do? In a nutshell, what are you doing? Number 4, church planting vision. Describe how you'd form a church planting vision in your church from its inception. So if you're going to be a church planting church, so right from the off, how are you going to build this DNA into your church? And then fundraising. How will you gather the funds necessary to plant your church? What's your thinking there and how you're going to do it? So first of all, timing. And Riley, how did you think about power through this, providing a timeline? Because you did have one. How did you think that through?
I'm trying to think now. We had an information night in November with the idea. For us, the summer period is December, January, February. So we wanted to launch the idea of the church plant, then give people sort of the summertime to think about whether or not they wanted to join. And then by mid-February, we had our first night together as a team of everyone that had committed to joining the plant. And then from there, we sort of decided it was too soon to start by Easter. So for our Easter, we go by a different calendar. Our Easter is around April, which would have been a nice time to start. And then the middle of the year for us is the winter, the slow time. So we thought, well, we'd start in the spring, in the September, which coincidentally is when they started. So we actually started about a week, 10 years apart, but a week within each other. And so we thought, well, that would be a good time to launch a church plant as the sun's coming out, new life, spring is going forward. And so there were some of those just elements there, just those pragmatic elements. Is like, when are people going to be out and about? When are people going to be wanting to come and experience something new? And also, how are we going to have enough time to build this team? Because I wanted to launch a fully functioning church from day one. And so that's what we did. We had enough time to do all these sessions. We did like 15, weeks at night, plus, picnics and all this stuff. So I wanted enough time to build our new church plant team into a church community family. And I think that was, 6-7 months? And it worked out really well. It was a good amount of time. And then as time got closer, we decided, well, let's do some practice services in the area about a month before our launch date. And we just chose a date in the end for launching. We just at that point, September 15, let's do it then. And so then we worked our way backwards from that. So I would think about that too, is if you start with the end in mind, you can reverse engineer. So if we say we want to plant in 24 months, you're like, okay, well then we're going to, that and then that and then that. Well, we're going to need to start gathering a team by this amount of time. If I want to take 6 months to build a team, well then I might need 2 months before that. And so you reverse engineer.
Excellent. What about budget? Provide a basic estimate of budget. How did you even start with that? Because it's obviously a big...
Yeah, the help for everything for me is basically because Dave went first, I was able to copy him. And so I actually took his original church plant budget for when he planted 10 years prior, and then I just started to look at the figures and compare them to, how times have changed, inflation and economically wise, and what they plan to do, and then say, well, we're not doing that, but we are doing that. We don't need to buy that, but you bought that. And I just started putting rough estimates together and did it in partnership with you because you're very good with it. It's the first time I'd ever done it. And then we just started going, all right, this is roughly about how much we need to do this. And then we had someone come on as a bookkeeper, so an accountant, so that they're actually tracking all the funds and the finances to make sure that it's lining up. And then we're basically trying to think of the ideal and the real. Like, we'd love to be able to do this, but is this actually possible, realistic-wise? And part of that goes into your fundraising. Some of the things we had to do is try and figure out from our members how generous they were. So we actually asked all the people in our church plant team, how much do you give? And we started asking them to give into an account 3 months before we planted the church, so that we could track the trend as to know how much money we were going to have, so that we would have a bit of an idea as to what kind of caliber we're working with. Are people tithing? Are people giving 1%? What are they doing? So those things helped us to factor in to make estimates. And then the whole budgeting process, you've got to estimate how much are people going to give, and you've got to think month by month. Are they going to give this much or this much? Is the church going to grow? Therefore, our giving's going to grow. Therefore, we've got more capacity to do this, or et cetera, et cetera. So the more complex, the more you're trying to do, our line, we probably had 25 line items in our budget, each with a different figure, each with projected figures, and then you're checking it each month. You go, okay, how much did we spend? How are we going? And it's just, and I learned all that from you.
Okay, that's how you planned it. Yeah, budget's a big one, and you probably want to be talking to Michael and find out what did they do before here. Mission statement, yes. Well, before I even planted in Australia, I had actually 3 different budgets, depending on what type of church we were going to probably be able to build. I had 3 different ones, and then you did the same. So I knew, hey, to probably run in our first year, it's going to be X amount of dollars, ideally. But we could probably do it on less. Or we could do it on more, depending on, are we going to go all in, or are we just going to be able to start in somebody's house? And it depends what you're trying to do. But you could definitely start on a lot less. And the truth is, for many of you guys here in Ethiopia, you're probably going to have to. So the overseas funding idea that we'll look at when it comes to fundraising, I think it'd be a real error to think like that all the time. That, we're going to start a church, and then we're going to appeal to Americans to give us money. Well, you're not going to be able to do that for 10, 20, 30 churches in Ethiopia. It's not going to be possible. So you're going to have to build a way of going, how do we do this within? So I think one of the things that I've appreciated about Diona in West Africa is we help fund them, but actually only a very small amount. And what we do is we help them build a school. The school provides students which give a little bit of income. They employ the pastor through that. They build that community. They then give 10% of everything they have into a central pot, and then they do it again and again and again. So they've got 16 churches that are built like that, not only in Liberia but Sierra Leone, for actually about $8,000 each. Total done, church planted. So the idea of, we probably need to raise $250,000 each time we plant a church, you will not be able to do it. So you've really got to think through, as Ethiopians, what are you going to do here to raise funds, to get people buying in? So in Sovereign Grace, often what tends to happen is you'll get some help to get it started, but that help won't keep going and going and going. It's what we call a church plant fund. It's like, okay, here's a grant for you to help start. But really, the hope would be within 2 or 3 years, that local church is tithing and giving enough to cover everything. So what you wouldn't want to do is build a church that's going to cost $100,000 to really service every year. But then you do the math and you realize we'd have to have 1,000 members to pull that off. Okay, well, is that likely to happen? No. So how are you going to keep funding it? What's the plan? And you guys have got to figure that out. You've got to. So it's a sensitive one, it is a tricky one, but I think that's actually a really important part of the process. I certainly wouldn't encourage you, and I've said the same to Michael and Josh, you just got to be careful with not, because it's funny, because we're a part of a global denomination, but if we build in an ethos that the West will always help us to do everything, I think it will weaken you. I think it will really weaken you. I think you'll regret it. I think the best thing is, okay, how can we get fellow Africans and Ethiopians to own this and then partner with the West? So we can stand alongside you, but we stand together. And I know that's a long-winded saying, but it's really important because I think you're right. So one of the things when I was chatting to Diona, again, West Africa, a little while ago, he said, you know what, and he's very grateful for Sovereign Grace, loves what we do. But one of the things he constantly says to me is he said, we must help Africans, because obviously he's African. He's like, we must help Africans think like Africans and not like Americans, because we are in Africa. And I think he's right, as in we've got to own it here. I've got to own my thing in Australia. You've got to own your thing in Ethiopia. He's got to own his thing in the West. And so we probably have to be realistic with what we can do. Because you can, the truth is, start a church with not a lot, and it can go good. So you have to think that through in your budget, what exactly you're trying to do, and how would you sustain it. So the truth is, this is asking you for a 1-year budget, but if you were actually going to plan, I'd be asking you for a 3 years budget. So it'd be like, oh, okay, what's your first year? What do you think your income will be off tithes and offerings? What will be the second year? How are you going to be, ideally get to a place of being self-sufficient within 3 years? Partly the reason for that is because that's going to help you plant more churches. But if you all require so much money, you just be like, well, we might be able to do like 2 in 10 years. We don't want to do 2. So how are we going to get these things going? Is that helpful? Makes sense?
Yeah, the idea of an A, B, C budget, like, in the ideal, we'll get a facility like this and we'll have this. Great, that'll cost this. A B budget, which is like, this is probably more realistic, and a C budget, which is like, this is a go budget. Like, if we just need to start, guitar, some fold-out chairs, whatever, coffee maker, we're good, So you kind of, that can be helpful, a way to think about it.
Yeah, and you might have some plants that are trying to do different things. So particularly what you were describing, it might be like, hey, that might need more funding than maybe this church plant. And that's okay. That's regional thinking, It's like, okay, what exactly are we trying to do? Our church in Moringa cost more than his church cost in Parramatta. It's just the way it goes. But neither church has any outside funding now. It just doesn't need it. You're just self-sufficient. The church gives, and you're raising it, and now we all give to a pot to plant the next one. That's the way it goes.
One of the things that we put in our budget is worth noting is we wanted from the beginning to give money towards future mission. And so we take 10% of all of our, and I don't know what it would be like for you guys, but we take 10% of all of our giving and then re-give it back out, back to Sovereign Grace, back to future church plants. We keep some of it here in Australia for church planting, and then we send it out to global. And then some of the things we budget in is we do special offering Sundays where we have particular projects that aren't in our budget, but if we could do them, oh man, that'd be great. And so every year in March, we take up a special offering on top of the normal tithes to do other things like, and actually you guys received some of our money to plant this church. So we gave towards this, we gave towards Diona, we've given towards, things like that. And we budget and we try and think, how much will we get? We put it in the budget. So we're budgeting our receiving, our expenses, and our giving. And it's in our budget that we're a giving church. And I want my church to be, thinking, how else can we spread money elsewhere? And it could be small, it could be really big, but that's what we've done from day one. We learned it from you guys. Left to my own devices, I would have just been like, we're going to sort ourselves out, then maybe in 10 years' time we could help others. But it's been really great. Our church has been a part of so many different things across the world, and there's such a joy in our church, and it builds a generosity of spirit. And my experience is that when you do that, people lean in more with their finances and their giving, because they're like, oh, this is going, this is helping here, this is helping there, this is being used well, and it's actually spawned a culture of generosity. And our church is so grateful that we get to be sowing little seeds into things like, Trinity Fellowship, etc.
Yeah, you have to do a lot of research because you're like, okay, well, if we're going to employ a pastor, how much would he need? If we're going to pay rent, how much is that? If we're going to buy any equipment, how much is that? You have to, if we're going to serve coffee, how much is that? If we're going to buy any books, how much is that? So in a budget for us, and maybe we could put one up, but literally it's probably about 20, 30 things that all have line items attached to it. But then you've also got to work out the income. So all right, how much do I think my church is liable to give into this in the first year? So if we only have 30 members, what would tithing and giving look like for them? What would that mean? Okay, well, what's the difference? So what am I trying to raise outside of that? Okay, what would that be in year 2? So hopefully my church is growing and I wouldn't have some of the initial setup costs. So you really have to think through. You have to be quite exact in the costs. In fact, I've seen church plants not go too well when they overestimate income and underestimate expenses. That's problematic. So we had a church in Bolivia that got set up in Santa Cruz. They massively overestimated income and massively underestimated expenses. So within 6 months, they were pretty much broke. And that was a problem. Yeah, that's where you need some advice. You need some advice of Michael, of Josh, of other people who live in that type of area. Because you have to work out, well, what would this even look like? Ideally, you could almost do with a little bit of a finance board of people that could help you. Can you help me think through this budget? Because I don't really know how much. And so when I moved to Australia, I had no idea what an Australian pastor should earn. So it was 3 other guys that did all the research of all the other churches in the local area to try and find out an average. And they said, well, I think we want to pay you this. I'm like, okay, great. I just didn't even know. But I had to find a figure for my budget. I had to come up with something. So it's a good illustration. You might find, like, okay, if we're going to employ a pastor, we might not be able to employ like a helper. Or if we're going to employ a helper, maybe the pastor can't be full-time. He's got to get another job. You just can't probably just do everything assuming, we can just do it all. Maybe you can't. Maybe you'll want $50,000, for example. But in reality, you're like, you can have 20. So now we have to make a decision. What are we going to... But I think a wise lead pastor goes, I'm going to have different contingencies. So I'm shooting for the stars, but if I don't get it, it's the ABC thing. It's like, I'd love this. If I can't get that, this would still be good. If I can't get that, I think this would be the minimum that I could pull it off. This would be, if I don't get this, I don't even know how we'd even planned.
And it's good to do it, like Dave said, with other people helping you. Because you might have the temptation to overpay yourself or underpay yourself.
Underpay. Probably you guys will underpay.
You're like, I feel bad taking money.
Planters often underpay. They're like, I don't think, and you're like, you're going to be on the bridge. This is going to be really hard to pull off. So you're going to need some advice. On that. In Australia, and we pretty much have quite a set pay structure for Sovereign Grace Churches in Australia. And that might be something you might want to consider down the track. As Sovereign Grace Churches Ethiopia, well, this is what we pay pastors. And you might just find in different areas, we add a little bit more because the cost of living is higher in that area. And in this area, the cost of living or the rent is lower, so we do it a little bit lower. And so our salaries actually work out as rent and salary. Because rent goes up and down depending on where you live. So my rent is a lot higher than his, just partly because of the areas we live in. But our salaries are actually exactly the same, the salary piece. So that's a way that it works in Australia. It's quite easy to do. But that can be helpful to know, like, okay, this is what Sovereign Grace, if I'm a pastor in Australia, in the Ethiopia, this is kind of what we get paid. And
we do different salaries if you're ordained versus not ordained. How many years you've been working in a pastoral position, so like an experience-based things, stuff like that. I don't know what it would be like.
All the things you haven't done yet, but you tend to do different, bands and stuff like that. Yeah. It's a great question. It's probably going to need to be a bit tied into your membership piece. So in our church, we would expect members to give. But if you've had a whole year where no one's even a member, it's difficult to have those expectations. So you'd probably tie it into that. I think an obvious thing would be tied. Because if you're taking 20 people from this church that are used to giving, and then they go to a new church and they can have it free for a year, that's a bit odd. And it actually does them a disservice because of a whole variety. Where your treasure is, there is your heart. You're like, actually. So I think I'd be careful with the whole idea of, and I don't know your culture fully, but I'd be careful with the idea of, because money's abused, we won't do it here at all. I'd rather take a line of, it's been abused, we want to re-educate people to what biblical giving is and why it's important.
For like a small amount of...
You might have time. So we don't expect like visitors to give. We don't. It's not even on the radar. But when somebody comes into membership, we teach it in the membership class that, hey, listen, one of these, we want people to give generously, and that's how we exist. And if you try and maybe repeat what Michael's done, it's doable, I guess. But then you'd have to think through, okay, so you want X amount of dollars the first year, but no income. Where's that coming from? Yeah. Who's giving you that? So the answer, and my answer to that would be, you could sell an organ. The answer to that would be, does this church want to give you money for that? If they said, well, yeah, we're going to sponsor your first year, okay, you're done. It might be that Michael's church and Sovereign Grace could come together to help do that. But even then, you've still got to think, okay, so year 2, people are going to start giving. How much are you going to get? There's ways of doing it. You've just got to make the numbers add up and not be too. Well, the way it works in Sovereign Grace is around the world is every Sovereign Grace church, and nearly every Sovereign Grace church, gives 10% of their income to a central pot, which is where you get plants from. So if you started, for example, Sovereign Grace churches of Ethiopia or East Africa even, and you said, okay, well, each of our church plants are going to give 10% of the income into the pot. Well, what happens is that pot, and it's for planting, church planting. When you want to plant another church, within 3 or 4 years, you've got X amount of dollars in there. You're ready to go again because you've got the pot. So you've got to think through how are you going to partner together, because that's how you raise funds. So when Riley went out, we were able to give him some money out of Sovereign Grace Churches Australia, and then our church took up another offering and gave them money to go as well. And then Sovereign Grace Central gave them some money. But they also took some of the best givers in our church with them. So they were self-sufficient really, really quickly. Which you would probably experience, you would more likely experience if you take people with you, you know. And in my mind, or maybe simplistic, if you take 10 people with you and they're earning and giving, well, that's what the pastor's salary is, whatever the sum of those 10 people is. So I would be like, teach generous giving very well, because it's important. Don't go Hillsongish, where it's like it's a rule and blessing and all that. That's not it. But teach it from the Bible. That giving is a good thing. You know, don't store up for yourselves treasures here on earth. You teach it well, and people go, I want to do that. It's just been abused in my old church. But it's still how you get church plants going. I love the way you're thinking. It's good. Very practical. Okay. Mission statement. How did you come up with that?
Stole your one.
You did. Yeah, excellent. So before we planted in Australia, I literally sitting at my desk. I was still a pastor in Newport, Wales at the time, and I thought, yeah, how can I say in a sentence what we're trying to build? Because if somebody just says, "Tell me about your church plant. What are you trying to do?" You ideally want to be able to answer that question. And if you're just like, "Well, we're building a church, and it's going to be, we're going to be preaching the Bible and singing, and we want to do it just starts to sound like you don't really sound like exactly what you're doing. You know, so if somebody says, "Tell me about your church," you ideally want to be able to answer it in like a sentence. So people have lots of different ones, but for us, it was that, we're building together a community that are passionate about knowing, applying, and proclaiming the gospel. All right, what's that? Tell me more about that. But I've at least given all the headlines of that's who we are. Some people are like, you know what, our church is all about seeking the lost and discipling the found. That's really what we give ourselves to as a church. And it's really helpful to be succinct so you can explain to people. Some people would say, oh, they don't go that route. They're more like, we're just a reformed charismatic church that love Jesus and want to tell people about Jesus. Okay, fine. But at least we've got something where we're saying to people, this is who we are. This is what we're about. That can be super helpful. My experience is the best planters can do that. In the States, if we do the church planting course with you, they literally get you to light a match. They light a match and you hold it, and then they say, "Well, tell me what your church is about," and you've got to tell before you burn your fingers, because they want to know, can you articulate what you're actually about? And sometimes you find the planters don't. They just don't really. Oh, we're just doing stuff, and they burn their fingers. We won't do that for you.
The difference I did with my mission statement was I took the mission statement because I believed it's a really faithful way of summarizing not only what a church should do, but actually what a mature Christian is. So a mature Christian is someone who knows the gospel deeply, applies the gospel broadly in their life to everything, proclaims the gospel boldly. But I added in to the end of the sentence, in Parramatta. So we're building a community of believers who are passionate about knowing, applying, and proclaiming the glorious gospel of Jesus Christ in Parramatta. Because my church was a bit different to yours in that I wanted to plant a church that had a radius that said, our groups are going to be here, our mission is going to be here, this is our area. So when people can join from outside of Parramatta, but where they're knowing from the get-go that we're not going to be going to you, you're going to be coming to us. And so we're trying to reach our area. So that was in my mission statement, location bound, to make it a bit more specific. And that was my coach that helped me think through that, Eric.
That's really good. That's a really good illustration. So you might be like, you know what, yeah, our mission statement is, we're passionate about it, believing a community.
Knowing Jesus, making Jesus known in.
So my old church actually in the UK, we were just Christchurch for ages. And then as time went on, it got changed to Christchurch and Newport. And it can sound like a strange, a little thing, but it really helped our church because it's like, we're here. We're for this city. We're not just trying to come from wherever.
The negative side of us defining us as Parramatta is the other side of the coin is that his church was called Sovereign Grace Church Sydney, but that's like saying Sovereign Grace Church Addis Ababa. It's like, it's a big area, right? So when we said we're Parramatta, it meant they sort of had to define themselves a little bit geographically as well, which wasn't really your preference.
No.
So sorry about that.
And we still don't really do it. But now we oscillate between Sovereign Grace Church Sydney and Sovereign Grace Church Wahroonga. But it just depends who we're talking about. All right, but yeah, think through your mission statement. Get clarity on that. Church planting vision.
Just to go back to the mission statement, we use that as our membership. That's our membership course. We give an overview of what Sovereign Grace is, and then we do session 1, knowing the gospel. Session 2, applying the gospel. Session 1 is overview, knowing, applying, proclaiming. What does it mean to join our church? So we're trying to build our church members into the mission statement because we believe it's a summary of the Bible and a description of a mature Christian. It's what we want everyone in the church to be doing.
Part of the reason why I came up with that is because I wanted the church to be really gospel-centered and to feel that. But the knowing, applying, proclaiming bit helps unpack what that even means. Otherwise, every church is gospel-centered now. Every church around the world, I'm gospel-centered. But what do you mean by that? Unpack that for me a little bit. Church planting vision, look, for us, the very first morning, we did 2 things. Well, 3 things. The very first morning we gathered as a church, we spent time praying for future plants. So it was in the very DNA of our church that right from the off, we want to plant this church so that other churches can be planted. Secondarily, we committed to giving 10% of our income to a central pot from week 1. Anything that was given, we are saving that for church planting, other church planting in the area, which Riley was the first. The third thing we do is we regularly in the pastoral prayer pray for other churches and pray for different opportunities. So we would pray for your pastor's college, for example. It'd be like, because we just want people to have that mindset, not just a global mission, but actually like we are a church planting denomination. That's what we want to do. So those 3 things really helped us to build church planting as a vision into this is what we are. It wouldn't be uncommon as well that we'd be saying to people, listen, we love this church, it's a family, but let's not get so family that we're not thinking about people beyond us. We were just building that into people in messages or in church news or whatever it be, really. Just constantly hitting that nail. What do you do?
Very similar things we've already spoken about, but telling our members from day one, like, this is what we're going to do. And new members, we want to plant more churches. And then as opportunities arise, we're building our church into those opportunities. So a group of people in another city about 3 hours drive away said, hey, we'd like you to plant a Sovereign Grace Church here. So we're telling our church, we're hoping, we're not sure how we're going to do it. And would you pray for us as we go out and meet these people? And would you pray for a church planter? And we have monthly mission prayer nights at our church. And every now and again, we'll pray for our church to be a church planting church. And so we want people to be born in so it's not a shock. So it's encouraged the whole way through.
Yeah. And then the fundraising piece we've already touched on. But yeah, I'd be thinking through how are you going to transition your church from an outside supported church to an inside self-sufficient church. I think that's going to be really important for you guys in Ethiopia, for you to be able to plant lots of churches. You're like, I got to transition my church somehow to be self-supporting. It's not hard if people give to it. It's hard if they don't. And I agree with you, that sort of Hillsong vibe. They're usually very wealthy and it's abused, and that becomes a challenge. But I think, and we face that, but I think that the best thing to do that is to teach faithfully and better, teach really well on it.
And give generously yourself.
It starts with yourself, yeah, it starts with me. That's for me in my life. So for me, just tithing is that's like a minimum. I'm just getting, for me personally, everything that the Lord provides me from whatever environment, 10%, I'm giving it to the Lord right off. And then I'm looking at, well, what can I give on top of that? to help, to aid. It does start with the leaders, with the very people that are leading the church. And sometimes it can be difficult because you're like, oh, that's easier for you because you're in a wealthy environment. The challenge of being in a wealthy environment is things are very, very expensive. They really cost a lot of money. So, for example, I pay $850 rent a week to live in Sydney. A week. Exactly. So you think, oh, you guys must be wealthy. And you're like, no, because the living is very, very, very expensive. So it's not as obvious as it would seem that you're like, how money's going to be provided. So you have to work out, okay, so as for me and my house, what are we going to do? What are we going to be about? And so I think we want to be teaching the churches faithfully to give. And if my experience is if churches do that, they give generously and faithfully, you'll do great. As long as you don't overextend yourself, which cuts into what you're saying, Jane. If you overextend yourself, where you're like, we've built like a sort of a Western city church in a rural Ethiopian context, we cannot afford. It doesn't make sense. So you've really got to wrestle through what would be self-sufficient here? What would work? That doesn't mean you might not need extra income to get it blasted off the ground, but longer term. So I know when chatting to Michael and Josh, for example, they're working a plan to see Trinity Fellowship get to a place of being self-sufficient. Because they know once they can do that, it's going to be easier to help you men plant churches. But very hard if they're not self-sufficient yet. So you've got to work that into your thinking, your preaching, your mindset. Even core team for us, it was just a constant, let's be passionate in our giving, guys, for the Lord. Let's make a difference.
It's very hard to lead the church to give generously and sacrificially if you're not doing it yourself. And so just encourage you guys, if you're not giving generously and passionately now, to start it. To consider with whatever you've got to start going for it and sowing in. And you may not reap the rewards until you get in heaven. Obviously, we don't believe in the prosperity gospel, but you can't keep, there's a famous line, you can't take it with you, but you can send it on ahead. And that's the idea of that we reap the reward in heaven. And so if you're not doing it now, I would say you need to really start looking at that for your own self because you won't be able to call your people to do it. And it's just a biblical principle. And you're missing out on treasures in heaven. So, I'd encourage you to start thinking about it. If it's not currently a category for you, it's like, oh, am I a generous giver? Let alone, is anyone else going to help give me money? Yeah.
And I was saying to a couple of the guys yesterday, it's got nothing to do with, it's the heart. It's dealing with heart. Our church in Ukraine at the minute for Sovereign Grace is really struggling because they're getting bombed. They're dealing with refugees every day. So Sovereign Grace globally was trying to raise some money for them, and we've supported them for just doing the math. We've already supported them for about 22 weeks, something like that, to try and help them, to really help give food on the table. Every week they change their church. It's a bit bigger than this, but this becomes 90 beds, and they let people stay there. They feed them all. This is just people in the church. It'd be like people arriving in Trinity Fellowship, but you're getting 300 people in a week walking down here, come at the church, and then going off, and you're helping them go off. But here's one of the sweetest things. Our churches in the Philippines, who would be very poor, they took 3 offerings in their churches and bundled it all together and sent it to Sovereign Grace, and can you send this to the Ukraine? That blessed me so much, because it's not about the money. It's not about how much. It's just, we want to play our part. It's like the churches in Macedonia. It's just like, don't rob us of this privilege. They're begging to give. And we want to build that mindset, because it's all part and parcel of the same.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, you want to have a church that begs to give. It's like, it's almost like, no, we want to be the giving church, not the receiving church. That's the kind of mentality.
Yeah. It's where you've just got to be careful with what you're saying. And I get it, and I'm not saying don't do it. But it's just like, you somehow you'd have to transition that church from you're not going to give it all, to now I'm going to try and help you beg to give. It's just a big change, so you just got to think through how you might do that.
Because it feeds into that value that we're united in mission, fellowship, and governance, and that means giving-wise too. A few questions.
Look, it may or may not be something to think about. I mean, I know when Diona does that, those pastors don't lead the school. So somebody else comes in as a principal to do the school. They just get employed there as well. I don't even think they do a lot of the teaching of the kids, but they're just involved. But their primary responsibility is to get alongside some of the parents. They do outreach all the time. That's what they do. So it'd be like you, if I took you to Liberia and you're employed by Diona, you're not running the school. There's a principal that's going to do that, that's going to be paid for, but you're also going to get in part support by that, and you're going to start going around all the parents. So like in one of the schools, there's 330 kids. So suddenly you get all these parents, you're like, how are you? And, we're a Christian school, and how can I be praying for you? That's what they do, and that's how they build that community. They're more like the chaplain of the school, the chaplain of the school, but then they become the pastor of the community, because they'll just plant in a community that's just sort of, it's all there. That's their kind of model. That's how they do it in Sierra Leone as well, in Guinea. It's the same model they use. It may or may not work here. But no, it may not work, but some form of, I wonder what we could do. Yeah, so Diona in particular, and he might be worth you guys engaging with at some point from an African perspective. Have taught me through. He's just a good businessman. He just thinks through. So another thing he'll often get asked for funding from Sovereign Grace is about like, look, if we could get, and it's not a lot of money, but if we could have X amount of money to buy this field, we could help our pastor work out how to do agriculture. That would feed his family for the year. Okay, let's do that. So we have an initial outlay, but then this guy's totally self-sufficient because he's living off the field. So that's what they've done in Sierra Leone. I've seen the fields, and I've seen the pastors doing the ploughing, and you're like, yeah, this is very clever. So rather than it being like a constant, just keep giving every year, it's like, no, we're trying to help start up something that becomes something that you can carry on with, which I think is more sustainable.
And the tension is, right, you've only got a certain number of bullets you can fire, like time slots you've got in the week. And so if it's going to take 50% of your time to run this business's mission, it just means the church will have 50% less of you. And that might be all right for a time. And then you can, transfer responsibilities. And so that might be a way to get started. And so you just got to be canny and thoughtful with it, and make, like if you're trying to plant a church, but you have to spend 95% of your time on the business to fund the church, and then there's no time to do the church, well, it might not be worth it. Or might slow down the planting of the church. So just things like that can be helpful to think through.
Look, I think it can be helpful, but I think you'd have to be very careful what you do. So to give you an illustration, I think Liberia are a good illustration. That Diona actually isn't, he's the head of the organisation, but he's just a pastor. But he knows by employing like the principals and building schools that he has a whole other staff to do. This is how we'll get the gospel done in Liberia and Sierra Leone and those places. In my old church in the UK, we owned the building. So it was bigger than this, but say it's this. We then employed another man to run the building as a conference centre because we weren't running a college like this. So we started to make a lot of money because big companies wanted to come in and hire the facility, and then we would give them food. I was nothing to do with it. There was another man doing that. But we actually made a lot of money for the church, which enabled the gospel mission to be done. But I think where I wouldn't get blurred, or I'd be careful not to get blurred, is that it doesn't take too much of your time as a pastor, because that's not really what pastors are called to do. So you really want, you'd be better off to think, okay, this is going to help, but if I'm going to make, for example, if I'm going to make $10,000 out of this, and I can pay somebody $2,000 to run this, great. So we've only made 8, but it's 8 that you didn't have before, and it's helping you to do the gospel mission. Don't get involved too much with the stuff though. So I think you have to be careful, otherwise it gets a bit messy. Stuff like that. Yeah, so I've known churches, for example, to try and find investment to own a coffee shop or something like that. And then all the profits they've given to the church. And that's how they've done it, because the church owns the coffee shop. None of the pastors are in the coffee shop. They employ a couple of people to run it. Any profit all goes to the church because it's their money. Stuff like that's clever. What wouldn't be clever is if they own a coffee shop and it's the 2 pastors serving in there every day. So no, that's definitely not clever. That's not going to work. But if that helped you, if then even your Sunday service, lo and behold, is in the coffee shop on a Sunday, and it's a community thing.
And you could even serve in the coffee shop because it could be a good way to meet people.
I know a church in the UK that does it like that. They literally run a coffee shop every week. So it's a room like this. They set all the tables out. It's a coffee shop. And then on Sunday they put all the chairs away, and then it's their church. And it's even good for a community aspect because they're coming into your church and evangelize. Oh yeah. So you could do a youth club in the same building. There's so many things you could do.